For today's video, I'll be comparing two of the most popular plants in the aquarium hobby, Java Fern and Amazon Sword. I keep both of these in my 40-gallon tank. My Java Fern is grown on the right-hand hardscape island, while my Amazon Sword is planted in the back right corner, but I've had both plants in other tanks previously. To try and keep things visually interesting, I'm not just going to focus the video footage on both of these plants, I will be showing other fish and stuff like that just to try and mix things up. So I want to start with a quick overview of each plant, and I also have full care guide articles on my website, and I'll link to both in the video description for each species. First up is Java Fern, which is commonly known by the Latin name Microsorum terapis. Technically, that Latin name is outdated due to a genus reclassification recently, and the correct botanical name is Leptochilus terapis, but in the future you may see either of those Latin names on Java Fern. The plant is native to a wide range of habitats across Southeast Asia, where it's often found grown above the waterline year-round. Many clusters of wild Java Fern are never submerged, and some of the ones that are only ever submerged during the wet season in their native areas. Although Java Fern is often sold as a beginner-friendly plant, personally I really don't think it is, and I would say that Java Fern is more of a medium difficulty plant, and I'll go over why throughout the video. In my personal experience, and the experience of almost everyone I personally know who keeps this plant, it's a total lottery whether the Java Fern is going to thrive in a typical low-tech aquarium or melt. Then we have Amazon Sword with the Latin name Echinodorus belleri. This is a hugely popular plant in the hobby, and it's one that I personally would genuinely consider as being very beginner friendly. Now, it is worth noting that some shops do sell Echinodorus amazonicus under the same common name of Amazon Sword, but it is technically a different variety. Echinodorus amazonicus' proper common name is narrowleaf Amazon Sword, where Echinodorus belleri, the plant I'll be talking about in this video, is the true Amazon Sword. Echinodorus belleri is native to South and Central America, where it grows across a huge range of different environments. Just like Java Fern, some populations spend large amounts of the year out of water in their immersed form and only convert to their submerged form during the wet season. Overall, Amazon Sword is generally considered an easy plant to keep, and in my opinion it is definitely an easier option compared to Java Fern. So moving on to care requirements, and on paper at least, both plants have very similar needs, which is one of the reasons so many people promote them as beginner-friendly plants. Lighting recommendations from plant nurseries are a little dated in my opinion, but I honestly think that's nothing malicious to try and get you to buy more expensive lights. It's just entry-level aquarium LED lighting technology is advancing very, very rapidly right now. So in practice, both Java Fern and Amazon Sword will be completely fine under a modern entry-level planted tank LED light such as the Siora SR616. My recommendation would be to set the light to full intensity and let it run for around 6 hours per day. It's what I do on most of my tanks using that light, and I've had no issues with plant growth. Neither of these plants require CO2 injection systems to grow in your aquarium, but some sources do suggest that Java Fern may be a little more stable with predictable growth when the CO2 system is used on the tank. As for water temperature, both plants usually end up getting the generic tropical plant water temperature range recommendation, which is between 22 and 28 degrees Celsius or 72 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a very popular guideline for tropical aquarium plants because if it goes too much below this, then your plant may enter dormancy, which is essentially a type of hibernation where very little happens until the water warms up and nutrient deficiencies may start to form. I've personally tested both Java Fern and Amazon Sword in tropical tanks, subtropical tanks, and temperate unheated tanks, and they definitely both do better in tropical and subtropical temperatures. In my temperate unheated tanks, both species did melt. So switching over to the upper temperature range of 28 degrees Celsius or 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is commonly recommended because your water holds less dissolved CO2 the warmer it gets. That means that if your water temperature goes too much above this, then it can essentially gas off all of the natural CO2 it's produced that your plants would use for growth, potentially resulting in problems. So my advice would be to try and stick to the 22 to 28 degrees Celsius or 72 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit bracket with either species if possible. When it comes to nutrients, I personally rely on what I call the fish poop fertilization method. I know plenty of other people who use this now without needing to buy expensive liquid fertilizers or root tabs or anything like that. I do have an article that goes into a lot more detail on this method, which I link to in the video description, but in short, it uses the fish waste, shrimp waste and snail waste that develops in your tank and essentially lets waste-eating bacteria break it all down and use it as fertilizer for the plants. While this method does work well for both species, I have personally seen that Java Fern does tend to noticeably grow better if I feed my shrimp potassium-rich foods like blanched spinach. Some people do use potassium-based liquid fertilizers to overcome this, but if you're like myself and you keep snails or shrimp in your tanks, you need to feed them anyway, so I personally just choose to use high potassium foods to spike the potassium levels in their waste. So overall, both species can thrive in low-tech planted tanks and have the potential at least to be beginner-friendly. And that brings me on to a more detailed look of both of these species as beginner-friendly plants for someone who is keeping their very first planted tank. As I mentioned earlier, both species are commonly recommended as entry-level beginner-friendly plants, but personally I don't always agree with that. For me, Amazon Sword has always been a very easy plant to keep, provided I'm keeping it within the water temperature range I mentioned earlier. The only issues I've ever had with it is when I've kept it in room temperature unheated tanks. So when it comes to Amazon Sword, I do agree that it's a very beginner-friendly, entry-level plant that pretty much anyone should be able to keep in their planted tank. Then we get to Java Fern, and this one can be far more unpredictable. Around a year ago, the Java Fern in my 40-gallon tank started to have issues with nutrient deficiencies on its leaves, but every other plant in the tank was completely fine. My friend's dad's been in the hobby for decades and he recommended that I start feeding my shrimp blanched spinach or dandelion leaves and things like that which have a higher than average potassium content. Interestingly, the problems quickly went away with my Java Fern after doing this, and the new healthy leaf growth coming through didn't have any holes or any noticeable problems. But a few months back I switched my shrimp diet in my 40-gallon tank back to regular algae wafers which have far less potassium and the little holes started to show up again. So I personally do think that Java Fern can be particularly sensitive to potassium deficiencies, which unfortunately are very common in low-tech planted tanks. The other theory that I've seen a lot of people report is problems with water flow causing issues with their Java Fern, specifically water flow around the rhizome of the plant, which is a horizontal stem-like structure that the leaves grow from. Java Fern can produce a surprisingly large number of leaves in random directions, and if you leave it to grow out to get that dense bushy look like I used to, a lot of these leaves may block water flow to the rhizome. That could theoretically at least limit nutrient access to the rhizome and cause the plant to start melting. These days I am trying to trim my older Java Fern leaves more frequently to prevent any water flow problems to the rhizome while also feeding my shrimp high potassium foods. I also want to touch on water hardness since this can sometimes be another tricky, unpredictable factor when it comes to plant growth. In general, if your water is soft to moderately hard, you really shouldn't run into problems. However, there are discussions online and even some plant nurseries that say both Java Fern and Amazon Sword can do just fine in hard water. While this is controversial, I do personally think that it depends on what we are talking about when we talk about hard water. That's because both species may be completely fine with a higher than average general hardness, which usually measures calcium and magnesium content in the water, and is often what a lot of people specifically mean when they say water hardness. But the problem is if you have a high GH or general hardness in your tap water, then there can also be a high KH or carbonate hardness, which measures the various carbon compounds such as carbonate and bicarbonate. This is when issues may start to appear with your aquatic plants in your tank. So while the people you see online saying they are growing Java Fern and Amazon Sword in hard water, I personally do have a theory that they may have a high GH but low KH on their test kit, whereas the people who report they have problems with them in hard water probably have a high GH and a high KH. Thankfully, I don't have this issue because I do have soft tap water anyway, and it's difficult to prove it either way because there's a lot of variables, but it is something to keep in mind. Moving on, and we get to planting options, and Java Fern is an epiphyte, which means it's usually best used attached to hardscape like driftwood or rocks rather than buried in the substrate. Technically, you can rest the rhizome on the substrate if you like and leave the roots to grow into it, but most people who are getting Java Fern use it to detail their hardscape. Amazon sword, on the other hand, is usually planted directly into the substrate like most people would expect with a plant. The problem with this one is that there is a persistent myth in the hobby that Amazon sword is a heavy root feeder that requires a nutrient-rich substrate. In reality, that isn't true, and it's been debunked plenty of times from different sources. Dennis Wong, who runs the 2-Hour Aquarist brand, has a great article going over it, and unfortunately the videos are no longer available, but the Skeptical Aquatics channel had some videos documenting them growing Echinodorus plants in bare-bottom tanks with no substrate at all, where the detritus from their fish waste was used as a fertilizer and they were thriving. The main point that I'm trying to get across is that if you don't want an expensive aquasoil product in your tank to keep Amazon sword, you really don't need it. So moving on, and we get to growth and size of the plants. Personally, I'd say Java Fern has a slow to moderate growth rate, while Amazon sword tends to have a moderate but potentially fast growth rate. This could be an advantage for Java Fern if you're looking for a low maintenance plant that requires far less trimming compared to Amazon sword. On top of that, some of my Java Fern leaves usually max out at around 30 cm or 12 inches before I end up having to trim them. This makes it a great option for the mid and background of lower tanks, and the smaller leaf size and slow growth rate makes it far easier to manage. Amazon sword, on the other hand, can get far larger than Java Fern. The longest leaf I've personally grown in one of my own tanks was around 50 cm, but a good friend of mine has far larger tanks and he has some of his Amazon swords getting over 70 cm, which is around 28 inches. For most people's setups, this means Amazon sword is going to be a background plant unless you're willing to trim it consistently, but then it can kind of look a little strange if you are consistently trimming it down. It's probably worth mentioning at this stage that there is a massive range of different Echinodorus species in the hobby these days, and the time of having to get an Amazon sword for a mid-ground plant and constantly trim it are thankfully well gone. Other varieties like Echinodorus aquatica, red diamond or rennie usually max out at around 20 cm, which is around 8 inches, making them far better options for the mid-ground without needing to constantly trim it back. So the key takeaway here is that Java Fern tends to grow slower and stay smaller, reducing maintenance, while Amazon sword can grow surprisingly fast and surprisingly large, often catching beginners out. I do want to quickly touch on compatibility with both livestock and other plants because this is something that is often overlooked. Both Java Fern and Amazon sword have broad, fairly long leaves, which provides plenty of hiding spots and sight breaks in your tank. This can help reduce aggression or stress in your fish and give your livestock a sense of security and places to hide. When it comes to creating hiding spots in your tank, I do personally class it as a draw because you can use either plant for that purpose. But compatibility with other plants can potentially become an issue. Both Java Fern and Amazon sword may block light to smaller plants growing beneath them if just left to grow. This is less of a problem with Java Fern because, like I mentioned, in my experience at least, it has a slow growth rate and it also has a smaller maximum size. Due to this, I personally usually trim it roughly every 3 to 6 months, and even then it's just a few of the larger leaves being trimmed off the rhizome. Amazon sword, on the other hand, as well as my Echinodorus cordifolius fluitans, do grow far taller and potentially at a far faster rate, so they do need more trimming to stop them shading out the other plants near them. While I don't track it very accurately, I would guess that I trim my larger Echinodorus species once every 2 to 3 months just to keep them under control. I do want to quickly touch on cost and availability. Both Java Fern and Amazon Sword are very common in the hobby, and you'll be hard pressed to find any aquatic shop out there that doesn't sell either of these. In my area, Java Fern does tend to be slightly more expensive than Amazon Sword. I guess it's because it has a slightly slower growth rate, so the nurseries have to keep it in their greenhouses for longer to grow it out, so they just put the cost up a little bit. That said, the price difference isn't huge, and overall availability and price really shouldn't be an issue for either of these plants. Finally, I want to look at situations where I think each plant comes out ahead of the other one. All things being equal, I'd personally give the edge to Amazon Sword. I consider it to be an easier, far more consistent plant, which gives it a higher chance of success if you are new to the planted tank side of the hobby. Because of its massive size, it also has the potential to be a centerpiece plant for your tank and catch the eye whenever you look at it. That said, the size of the plant can also be a big drawback, because I don't really see much point in keeping it in anything that's less than 75 litres or 20 US gallons. In my opinion, there's just better varieties from the Echinodorus genus in the hobby for smaller tanks in Amazon Sword. Then we have Java Fern, and the smaller size and slow growth rate may make it a better option if it grows well in your aquarium, because it really is far lower maintenance. If you're looking for something specifically to detail your hardscape, then the Java Fern will push ahead of the Amazon Sword for that one too. As I've tried to explain throughout the video, there is more of a risk in my opinion for the Java Fern, but I do understand that this is controversial. You'll see a lot of sources saying that Java Fern is easy and beginner friendly, and while it does have that potential, you can do a quick Google search for Java Fern melting and see how many people end up having problems with Java Fern. So in the end, I personally think Amazon Sword or one of the smaller Echinodorus varieties just push ahead of Java Fern. They're just far more consistent. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching. I know this went on for a little bit, but I did want to specifically explain a few things to try and make sure people could try and keep either species of these plants alive.